she is thinking like, oh yeah, it's all about money, it's all about beauty, it's all about this, it's about the Lamborghini. It's like, no, like how is he gonna treat you? And so there's also something very special to people about the other person who is very desired by a lot of people, treating them particularly nicely. Right? Like, I mean, you hear this notion of being picked, right?
Dr. Huberman teaches us that there's nothing more exciting than being picked by someone who we find are really attractive. This feeling comes from our deep need to be liked and to connect with others. We can be more charming and interesting when we learn from these simple secrets.
When people say relationship is hard, the only really hard part of a good relationship is just dealing with oneself and making sure that you're staying in that mode of caretaking. Because I do believe that if one is mainly focused on taking good care of the other person, provided they're also focused on taking good care of you. Talk about attachment and attachment styles. And this will offer you the opportunity to answer some important questions for yourself, such as, what is my, meaning your, attachment style in relationship? One of the most robust findings in the field of psychology is this notion of attachment styles. And this was something that was discovered through a beautiful set of studies that were done by Mary Ainsworth in the 1980s, in which she developed a laboratory condition called the strange situation task. Now, the strange situation task has been studied over and over again in different cultures, in different locations throughout the world, and in preparing for this episode, I actually spoke to 3 different psychologists. I spoke to a psychoanalyst, I spoke to a cognitive behavioral psychologist, and I actually spoke to a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, but a psychiatrist with a medical degree, and asked, is the strange situation task and the various attachment styles that emerge from that task, are those still considered valid? And indeed, all 3 of them said, if ever there was a literature in psychology that is absolutely tamped down and has a firm basis in both data and real world principles and real world examples, it's this notion of attachment styles.
What do you think is the secret to a successful relationship?
There isn't just one, but at least in the top 5 is master, or at least be good at autonomic self-regulation. Know how to calm yourself down. Don't expect looking to anything external to soothe yourself it puts you in a terrible position to be a caretaker of yourself and other people, right? So learn how to self-soothe, right? Learn how to calm your mind, steady your actions, steady your voice. There are tools to do that. We talk about on the podcast, but elsewhere, have that in place. I also think that if your main focus is on, you want to have good boundaries, et cetera, but on tending to the relationship, doing a little bit more than you think you ought to do. If everyone does that, it goes great. I mean, I'm sometimes so positively struck by how supported I feel, because for many years I was just kind of doing everything on my own. So any little thing, I'm like, oh my goodness, this feels huge. And also I think the dynamics have to be right. Let's be really honest. This is a little bit of a tricky topic, but there is a power dynamic in relationships. Sometimes, not all, but in some relationships, it works much better if one person leads and the other person follows. In other relationships, it's more mutuality, works best. People need to know what they need. And so knowing what you need and what you crave is really important. And then once you do that, you can create the relationship you want. I've seen that over and over again. And people are different. Ultimately, I mean, right, there's the dopamine phase of a relationship, and then there's the serotonin phase, the kind of more mutuality, coziness, and sweetness.
Yeah.
I mean,
safety for the woman.
And listen, and for the man. Listen, there's a really interesting literature about this. If you look at sort of who people select to have sex with versus who people select to try and form long-term relationships with them, I mean, there are many men who would not choose to be with the woman that is most attractive to everybody because they don't have the confidence they could keep her.
That's
right?
A good point.
Even if she's not a flirt and wouldn't be looking, right? Even if she didn't have a wandering eye. Some men deliberately wouldn't want to be with the most beautiful. People tend to match up pretty closely in terms of attractiveness. Pretty closely. Not always.
It's not because the pretty ones are airheads.
But you asked about income, and I want to make sure that, because I had David Buss on my podcast, and he's really the expert on this, so we're going to have to fact check this with him.
Yeah.
But yes, it's true that resource potential is an important variable because people have to think about safety and childcare and a number of things.
It's the only way I have
but women
a free
work
life.
too, right? Women can work too, right? They can opt to work and make money. But more important than any other feature across all cultures is that the woman reports that she sought someone who is kind to them. Not necessarily kind to everybody, but kind to them, right? Okay, so even if you think of like extreme money, right? Extreme money, or you think of extreme bodies or extreme resources, right? That somebody has. Women, in terms of who they tend to pair up with long-term, assuming heterosexual, shown up over and over again in the data, is that their top priority is that someone be kind to them. In other words, they're not interested in being with someone who's really wealthy who treats them like garbage.
Is that
And
also...
I think this gets lost because people think, oh, it's all about money. It's not all about money. It's about safety and kindness because you're talking about a long-term bond.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, then people say, well, what about this notion of gold diggers? And by the way, there are male and female gold diggers. I had friends in college who would say things like they wanted to marry a really wealthy woman. I was like, really? I just heard this from a few people. I was like, wow, you're thinking about that as your primary concern? They're like, no, but it would be great. I would hear people say that. There are also the female to male version of that. It's actually pretty rare, right? It's about safety and resources. And this also varies by culture, whether or not women tend to work or not work. Kindness towards them is critical, but not necessarily kindness to everybody.
Is that tied to reproductive success also? In that, like, if he's kind to me, he'll be kind to my kids and they have a better chance of surviving?
But I have to assume yes, right? Because the last thing you want is someone with a ton of reproductive potential, resource potential, who's going to treat you like garbage. Chances are they're not going to stay with you. Or you're going to be there, but then they're going to bring in other mates. And so when you look at the roots of jealousy and concerns about infidelity, or you look at the roots of sort of like concerns about resource potential and all that, it all kind of makes sense in this very old-fashioned model. It also makes sense in the model that we live in now. Kindness toward each other is fundamentally the most important variable, which is kind of reassuring. I don't say that to be politically correct. That's how the data fall out. And that never gets discussed because it's not as edgy as thinking like, oh yeah, it's all about money, it's all about beauty, it's all about this, it's about the Lamborghini. It's like, no, like how is he gonna treat you? And so there's also something very special to people about the other person who is very desired by a lot of people, treating them particularly nicely. Right? Like, I mean, you hear this notion of being picked, right? And there's mutual picking. And everything is changing now too, right? I mean, the way that there are apps like Bumble where women actually have to say that it's, yes, I will talk to you, right? It's not a bidirectional conversation. There's an asymmetric conversation. So again, not on the apps, but I'm fascinated by this because it's human dating behavior, but it's always going to be through the filter of biology. This comes from a friend of mine who's in a really excellent marriage with great kids and family and high demand life. It's a decision. Like at some point you just prioritize it as, okay, I'm going to make this happen one way or another. And you don't force the discovery of that person. But I mean, I've occasionally said, hey, I think you should meet this person or that person. And well, it wasn't, maybe my judgment might have been off, but the timing wasn't right or something. But I think that, it's a decision. And it also has to do with life structure. I mean, there were years, when I was in graduate school, I didn't want a girlfriend. I just wanted to be in lab, and I had romantic dating interests, but I wasn't going to meet them through a committed, live together situation. It wasn't where I was at. And as a postdoc, things are a little different, et cetera, et cetera. So, but at some point, it's sort of like, what do I want my daily routine to look like? Because ultimately, a relationship, however one structures it, is going to be part of your daily routine. So at the point where you're like, I'd really love to wake up next to somebody and do blank and blank together, and then I'd love to work, and then we meet for dinner, and then we, take the dog for a walk or take kids out or whatever it happens to be, take a trip and do it. One has to be in the mindset of wanting to do couple-like things. People, and a lot of people don't think about it that way. They either fall into something or they don't see the benefits of coupling up. I think that the pandemic tuned people's awareness to the fact that some things are indeed easier on your own. It depends on finances, et cetera, but a lot of things are made better done with other people.
100%.
answer this because you're a neuroscientist. So can the brain outpace evolution, where we have millions of years of evolution that men say, I'm attracted to these proportions that will nourish my kids the best, and women say, I'm attracted to these features that say he'll take care of my kids. Now society's changing in the last 70 years. Crazy rate of change. All this is like getting changed up. Can your brain outpace your evolution, which has been hardwired for millions of years, and say, you know what, I don't care about all these things?
So we have this real estate in our brain right behind our forehead called the prefrontal cortex, and it's your rule-setting machine, okay? So you can create new rules for what's gonna drive your behavior. Like we can decide that what's important in a given set of situations is blank. You actually see this, right? If people go away on retreats or they go to some event and there's only, let's say, again, we're assuming heterosexual relationships here, 10 men and 10 women, they're all heterosexual, who you find most attractive will be gauged against the other 9, right? Right. And so, but in a world in New York City, right, then the mean is that the distribution is much broader and the mean is shifted perhaps, right? And so you can't beat evolution. You're always going to be constrained by brain wiring, but you can condition certain things. And also sometimes people are selecting for somebody who's really nice, really funny. We get along so well. I mean, there are other criteria, right?
I'm just trying to get you to say it's okay for us to be shallow, really, at the end of the day.
It's as okay to be shallow as being shallow is important to you, right? There are people who are like, they have their list, right? They're like, I want to be with someone who graduated college, or I don't care, or I want to be with somebody who, is physically attracted to, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the reality is that no matter how attracted two people are to one another, like at some point it becomes familiar. But there are certain people, like I'll just disclosure, I'm actually become in a relationship, monogamous relationship, actually become more attracted to the person I'm with. And I think it's something through the nose. It's like a pheromone thing. Yeah. I become very conditioned to them, right? It's not that no one else becomes attracted to me, but I become very conditioned to them. And so I don't know that everyone's like that. I've only been me, but I know that there are some people that get really restless after they've been with the same person for a little while. And sometimes that's psychological, like they never got it out of their system. They married the first person they were with. And other times it could be physiological, Both of them. So there's a lot of range on these. I mean, the biology constrains it. When I was a kid, you occasionally catch a lizard, but it was like a little lizard.
Yeah.
Like,
warmer
That's
climates.
because he's like, no lizard is big enough.
So there are limits, right? Just like anything, right? It's sort of like food, right?
Yeah.
I mean, could I get used, like I like fermented food. So like I love kimchi and I love Korean food and but like Japanese natto. The first time I tried that, I was like, wow, it's really like stringy and like it's kind of mucusy. The menstrual cycle, which both men and women should understand, of course. Understanding arousal. Understanding, for instance, a lot of people don't realize this, but that orgasm is actually the consequence of activity in the sympathetic, meaning the stress arm of the autonomic nervous system, whereas arousal is the consequence of the activity of the parasympathetic, the calming aspect of the autonomic.
That's counterintuitive, right?
It's counterintuitive, and it kind of works like a seesaw. I mean, there's arousal, then there's relaxation, then there's arousal, but and then immediately after orgasm and in males ejaculation, what ends up happening is there's a rebounding of the parasympathetic nervous system, which it leads to oftentimes people feeling very relaxed or falling asleep. So I'm going to do a short series on sexual health that will include stuff about sexual performance, but also I'm working on getting an expert guest who can talk about some of the neurologic changes that happen as a consequence of sexual activity. What's very surprising is I get a lot of questions about sexual health from the young male audience. Well, here's what I think it reflects. I think that women, because of their menstrual cycles, early on start to talk to one another about changes in physiology and psychology as a function of this 28-day cycle that they all experience sooner or later. Males, there's less of a conversation, and it usually arrives in code. People will say, hey, what should I take to increase my testosterone? Nice. And I'll say, well, maybe nothing. What are you specifically concerned about? And then over time, if you pull on those threads a little bit, you get your answer. Sometimes I'll just get a direct question.
To get Freudian for a second, what role does sexual fantasy have in the human condition?
There's a book called The Erotic Imagination. It's a very psychoanalytic book written by a psychoanalyst that talks about here's the uncomfortable reality. Freud was at least right about one thing, which is that the brain circuitry that you used to develop attachments to your caregivers, mother and father or other caregivers, do not disappear when you hit puberty. They are repurposed for romantic and sexual relations. And so this is why the whole notion of anxious attached and secure attached, stems from childhood attachment patterns, but it carries over to romantic relationships.